It is nearly dawn on the morning of March 23rd, 1943. A German motorcycle and sidecar carrying 2 soldiers of the 10th Panzer Division blunders into the American lines in front of the town of Guettar, Tunisia. One soldier is immediately captured. The other is wounded. Under quick interrogation, the prisoner reveals something terrifying. A full-scale German armored attack is coming, right now, in minutes. American scouts peer into the dim light and see the silhouettes. A square formation of German tanks and self-propelled guns moving toward them across the valley floor. Dozens of them. Behind the armor, half-tracks loaded with Panzer Grenadier infantry. The 10th Panzer Division, one of the most feared armored formations in the entire German army, is rolling straight toward their positions. 3 miles to the west, a 55-year-old Major General named Terry de la Mesa Allen presses field glasses to his eyes. Allen commands the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. His men are dug in across the Guettar Valley, silent, concealed, waiting. What happens over the next 3 hours will become one of the most dramatic reversals of the entire Second World War. 30 German tanks destroyed by 0900. The 10th Panzer Division, an elite formation that had never lost a major engagement, driven back in disorder, leaving burning hulks scattered across the valley floor. But here is the part they do not teach you in most history classes. 27 days earlier, the United States Army had suffered its worst defeat of the entire war. 6,500 casualties, 183 tanks lost, a 50-mile retreat. A disaster so total, so humiliating, that the Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower faced a terrifying question. Can Americans fight Germans at all? The answer to that question was forged in the 27 days between the catastrophe at Kasserine Pass and the triumph at Guettar. In less than 4 weeks, the U.S. Army reinvented itself. New commander, new doctrine, new tactics, new artillery coordination, new everything. No other Allied army did that. Not the British, who needed 3 years of painful learning. Not the Soviets, who required 18 months of catastrophic defeats. The Americans did it in 27 days. To understand how and why it mattered for the rest of the war, we need to go back to February 1943, to the moment the American war effort nearly collapsed in the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, and to the man whose catastrophic failures made the transformation necessary. Part 1. The Disaster. Kasserine Pass. His name was Lloyd Fredendall, and in early 1943 he was one of the most trusted generals in the United States Army. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall had personally recommended him. Eisenhower himself had written to Marshall in November 1942, "I bless the day you urged Fredendall upon me." Those words would age like milk left in the Tunisian sun. Fredendall commanded 2nd Corps, the main American ground fighting force in North Africa. On paper, it was a powerful formation. The 1st Armored Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 34th Infantry Division, Rangers, artillery, tank destroyers, nearly 90,000 men. But there was a problem, a fundamental, devastating, career-ending problem. Fredendall was terrified, not of losing the battle, of losing his life. While his men dug shallow foxholes near the front, Fredendall had an entire battalion of combat engineers, men who should have been building fortifications for the troops, blasting tunnels into solid rock 70 miles behind the lines. His underground command post was called Speedy Valley. The troops had another name for it, Lloyd's very last resort. Think about what that means for a moment. An entire engineer battalion, weeks of work, blasting rock, pouring concrete, building an underground bunker complex, not for the soldiers who would face German tanks, but for one general who could not bring himself to go near the fighting. Omar Bradley, who visited, later called it an embarrassment to every American soldier. Eisenhower said it was the only time during the entire war he ever saw a headquarters so obsessed with its own safety. But Fredendall's cowardice was not his worst sin. His worst sin was tactical. He split his forces into what the military calls penny packets, small scattered units spread across 50 miles of desert with no coordination, no mutual support, and no ability to mass firepower. Imagine breaking a fist into 5 separate fingers and then trying to punch a wall. That is what Fredendall did to Second Corps. His orders were incomprehensible. He used a private code of bizarre slang that baffled his own subordinates. One actual order read, "Move your command," that is, the walking boys, pop guns, Baker's outfit, and the outfit which is the reverse of Baker's outfit, and the big fellows to M, which is due north of where you are now, as soon as possible. His division commanders had no idea what he was talking about. In the middle of a war, against Erwin Rommel. Remember that detail about scattered units. It will determine whether thousands of Americans live or die. And then, on February 14th, 1943, Rommel attacked. The German plan was a coordinated strike by the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions against American positions around Fied Pass and Sidi Bouzid. The execution was textbook. German tanks advanced in formation, infantry followed in half-tracks, artillery provided covering fire. It was the same combined arms doctrine that had crushed Poland, France, and half of Russia. The Americans were not ready. They were not remotely ready. At Sidi Bouzid, Fredendall ordered a counterattack on February 15th. 51 American tanks, M3 Lees and Grants, tall and awkward machines with high silhouettes that made them easy targets, rolled forward in what witnesses described as a parade formation. Straight lines, no cover, no coordination with infantry, no artillery support. The Germans were waiting. A line of concealed 88mm guns, dual-purpose weapons that could destroy a tank at ranges where American guns could not even reach, opened fire. One soldier who witnessed the scene said the tanks rolled right into the muzzles of the concealed 88s. Only 7 survived. 44 American tanks were destroyed in a single afternoon. Among the prisoners taken that day was Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, George Patton's own son-in-law. Waters had been commanding the 1st Battalion, 1st Armoured Regiment. He was captured when his unit was overrun and would spend more than 2 years in a German prison camp at Oflag 64 in Poland. Patton, tormented by guilt, later launched a controversial armoured raid behind enemy lines in March 1945, Task Force Baum, to try to rescue him. The raid was a disaster. Most of the raiding force was killed or captured, but the carnage at Sidi Bouzid was not limited to armour. The infantry paid the price, too. American soldiers had dug shallow scrapes instead of proper foxholes. They did not understand that German tanks would deliberately drive over shallow positions and rotate their tracks to crush men hiding inside. They learned that lesson, but the tuition was paid in blood. Now imagine being inside one of those tanks during the counterattack. You are a 20-year-old kid from Kansas. You trained in Louisiana against other American tanks. You have never seen a German Panzer. You have never heard an 88mm shell scream past your hull. And now you are advancing in a straight line across open desert, while concealed guns tear your formation apart, one tank at a time. That was Sidi Bouzid, and it was only the beginning. On February 19th, Rommel struck Kasserine Pass itself, a 2-mile-wide gap in the Grand Dorsal Mountains of the Atlas Range. American and French defenders fought hard, but Fredendall's scattered units could not coordinate a response. Each artillery battery operated independently, on its own radio frequency. A forward observer with one battalion could only call fire from that battalion's guns. Even if another battery was closer and better positioned, American artillery, which should have been devastating, was firing in isolated, uncoordinated salvos that the Germans easily avoided. Air support was non-existent. Units did not know where neighboring units were positioned. Some American troops retreated into areas already held by the Germans. The retreat lasted 5 days, 50 miles. American soldiers abandoned equipment and defensive positions. Trucks were left with engines running. Artillery pieces were spiked and abandoned. Terrified troops fled rearward under screaming Stuka dive bomber attacks. The sirens on those aircraft designed specifically to induce panic. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was there in the chaos, later wrote words that cut to the heart of the matter. The problem was not the men. The deeper a common American soldier got into a fight, the more of a fighting man he became. The problem was leadership, And Pyle was right. When the dust settled, the numbers were staggering. 6,500 American casualties, 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, 3,000 missing or captured, 183 tanks gone, 512 trucks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces. German losses? 989 casualties, 34 tanks. Let that sink in. The Germans lost fewer men in a week of attacking than the Americans lost in a day of defending. Omar Bradley called Kasserine Pass the worst performance of the U.S. Army in their entire history. German officers openly mocked American fighting ability. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring told Hitler that American soldiers were poorly trained and poorly led. British commanders Montgomery and Alexander concluded that Americans made poor soldiers and were unlikely to improve quickly. The verdict seemed unanimous. Americans could not fight, but Eisenhower saw something in the wreckage that others missed. Some units had held. At Thala and Spieber, American artillery, when it was finally organized, had stopped German advances with devastating firepower. The soldiers were not the problem. The system was the problem. And here is the most telling detail of all. Fredendall was quietly sent home and, remarkably, promoted to lieutenant general and given command of the Second Army, a training command in the United States. He would never see combat again, but the soldiers he had failed would get a second chance. With a different leader, with different rules, and systems could be fixed. What happened next, in just 27 days, would prove whether Eisenhower was right. But the first step required something brutal, something that would change the culture of an entire army overnight. And that required a man who was equal parts genius and tyrant. Part 2. The Surgeon. Patton's 17-day transformation. The story of how Patton got the job tells you everything about Eisenhower's ruthlessness when the stakes were high enough. In late February, Eisenhower had sent Major General Ernest Harmon, a hard-bitten tanker from the 2nd Armored Division, to assess the situation at 2nd Corps. When Harmon arrived at Speedy Valley at 3 in the morning, he found Fredendall in his underground bunker. Fredendall handed Harmon a written note authorizing him to take charge. Then Fredendall went to bed. Let that register. In the middle of a battle, with German tanks still pushing forward, the commanding general of 2nd Corps handed authority to a man he had barely met and went to sleep. Harmon stabilized the front, aided by the fact that Rommel was already withdrawing, having overextended his supply lines. Then Harmon reported back to Eisenhower with words that became famous in army circles. Fredendall was no damn good. Every division commander in 2nd Corps had lost confidence in Fredendall. The British General Alexander said he would welcome a replacement. The verdict was unanimous. On March 6, 1943, at 1000 hours, a 57-year-old cavalry officer named George S. Patton walked into 2nd Corps headquarters and took command. The contrast with Fredendall could not have been sharper. Where Fredendall hid 70 miles behind the lines, Patton went to the front. Where Fredendall issued coded gibberish over the radio, Patton spoke in language so blunt it could strip paint off a tank hull. Where Fredendall tolerated sloppiness, Patton demanded perfection that bordered on obsession, and he had 17 days to turn a defeated, demoralized army into a fighting force. Most people remember what came next as the discipline phase, the fines for unworn neckties, the court-martials for missing helmets, the inspections of uniform creases, and it is easy to dismiss this as theater. Soldiers certainly did. They called Patton a tyrant. Officers complained he cared more about appearances than combat. Some wondered if he understood they were preparing for battle, not a parade. But Patton understood something those soldiers did not yet grasp. An army that tolerates low standards in small things will tolerate low standards in deadly ones. If a man cannot be bothered to wear his helmet, can he be trusted to maintain his rifle? If an officer cannot enforce dress standards, can he enforce fire discipline under German attack? The changes were immediate and absolute. Every soldier in 2nd Corps was ordered to wear complete, clean uniforms at all times. Leggings, helmets, proper insignia, all mandatory. Officers who failed to enforce the standards were relieved on the spot. Patton personally drove through American positions every single day, stopping jeeps, inspecting weapons, questioning soldiers. He fined officers $50, roughly $900 in today's money, for not wearing neckties in a combat zone. He made enlisted men dig new foxholes because the old ones were too shallow. The men who had learned at Kasserine that shallow holes get you killed did not argue about this one. But here is the part most histories miss entirely. While Patton was fixing morale, Eisenhower was simultaneously rewriting the doctrine, and the doctrinal changes were even more important than the discipline. Remember the artillery problem at Kasserine? Each battery on its own frequency, each forward observer limited to his own battalion's guns. Within 1 week, Eisenhower's staff developed new fire coordination procedures. American forward observers would now be able to call fire from any battery within range, massing fires on a single target the way the Germans did. The technical challenges were enormous. Different frequencies, different procedures, officers who had been trained for years to think of artillery as a battalion asset, not a corps asset. But American artillery was already excellent in terms of guns, ammunition, and trained gunners. The only problem was coordination. Fix that, and you would unlock the deadliest weapon on any battlefield. The armor reforms went deeper. Before Kasserine, American tank doctrine said tanks should fight other tanks. This came from the cavalry tradition, horse against horse, but in practice, it was suicide. German tank commanders had 3 years of combat experience across Poland, France, and Russia. American tank crews had trained in California against other Americans. Sending them head-to-head against veteran panzers was like sending a college football team against the NFL. Eisenhower's staff reversed the doctrine entirely. Tanks would no longer fight other tanks. Tanks would support infantry. Tank destroyers, specialized weapons designed specifically for killing armor, would fight German panzers. And critically, tank destroyer battalions would fight as unified battalions, not be broken into platoons and scattered across the landscape. That scattering is exactly what had happened at Kasserine, and it had been fatal. The command structure reforms were equally dramatic. No more penny packets. Divisions would fight as divisions, not as dispersed fragments. Every unit had to be positioned where it could support adjacent units. Mutual support was mandatory. Air support reforms also began. Eisenhower created air liaison officers who embedded with ground units. He established procedures for calling air strikes and emphasized that air superiority was a prerequisite for ground operations. This would not be fully perfected until Normandy in 1944, but the process started here. These were not cosmetic changes. This was a complete rewrite of how the United States Army fought. New artillery procedures, new armor doctrine, new command structures, new air coordination protocols, all developed, tested, and implemented in less than 3 weeks. Why could they do this so fast? Keep that question in mind. I will come back to it, because the answer explains something profound about why America would dominate the battlefields of Europe for the next 2 years. By March 17th, just 11 days after Patton took command, the 1st Infantry Division moved forward into central Tunisia. The town of Gafsa fell with minimal opposition. The Italian Centauro Division defending it melted away. The next day, the 1st Ranger Battalion under Colonel William Darby pushed ahead and took the oasis town of El Guettar. The Americans were back on the offensive. The question was whether they could take a punch. That question was about to be answered in the most dramatic way possible, because the Germans were coming, and they expected to scatter the Americans the same way they had scattered them at Kasserine. They were about to discover that the army they were attacking was not the same army they had defeated 4 weeks ago. Not even close. Part 3, the test. El Guettar. German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim had taken command of Axis forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure on March 9. Von Arnim shared Rommel's contempt for American fighting ability. He looked at the American advance toward El Guettar and saw an opportunity, a quick spoiling attack to drive the novices back and protect his southern flank. He was about to make the most expensive miscalculation of his career. On March 22nd, von Arnim ordered the 10th Panzer Division to attack El Guettar and destroy American positions there. The 10th Panzer was no ordinary formation. It had fought in France, in Russia, and across North Africa. Its tank commanders had years of experience. They had never lost a major engagement. The officers planning the attack expected to scatter the Americans, just as they had at Kasserine Pass. But Terry Allen had spent the previous days preparing a very different kind of welcome. Allen was not Fredendall. Born at Fort Douglas, Utah, into a military family, his grandfather had fought at Gettysburg. Allen had commanded a battalion in World War I at the age of 30 and been wounded twice. He was the kind of officer who inspired fierce loyalty and drove superiors to distraction. His men called him Terrible Terry, a nickname coined by war correspondents that Allen himself hated. Before the war, at a social gathering in London, Allen had spent an evening drinking and swapping stories with a charming British officer. The next morning, someone asked Allen if he knew who his companion was. "No, who?" Allen replied. "The Prince of Wales." Allen could only manage, "Oh my God." That was Allen, irreverent, aggressive, utterly devoted to his men. He had once demanded directly to Eisenhower, bypassing his own chain of command, that his scattered division be reassembled. "Is this a private war, or can anybody get in it?" Eisenhower, impressed rather than offended, had reunited the Big Red One under Allen's command. After 5 months of active combat in North Africa, Allen knew the new doctrine cold, and he knew exactly what the terrain around El Guettar offered a defender. Allen positioned the 1st Infantry Division across the El Guettar Valley in depth, not in a single fragile line like Kasserine, but in successive defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. Forward units held high ground overlooking the valley on a steep ridge called El Kadab, dug in with proper foxholes deep enough to survive a tank rolling over them. Behind them, infantry battalions waited in reserve, and then there was the artillery. This was where the new doctrine would be tested under fire. Allen positioned his guns behind ridges, invisible to German observers, but pre-registered on every likely avenue of approach. American forward observers occupied concealed positions with clear views of the entire valley. Fire direction centers had direct communications to every battery. Ammunition was stockpiled. This time, there would be no isolated batteries firing on separate frequencies. This time, when the order came, every gun within range would fire on the same target at the same time. Now pay attention, because what came next at El Guettar would not have been possible without one particular unit, a unit that would fight the way it was originally designed to fight for the first and only time in the entire war. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. This was the very first pure tank destroyer battalion ever formed. Originally designated the 1st Infantry Division Provisional Anti-Tank Battalion in 1941, it had been with the Big Red One since the beginning. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker, had studied the terrain east of El Guettar and liked what he saw. On the night of March 22nd, he moved his battalion into position on the forward slope of El Kadab Ridge, like gunners sitting on the inside edge of a bowl, overlooking the entire valley and the Gabes Gafsa highway below. Baker had 31 M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks mounting 75mm guns. These were not tanks. They had no turrets, no overhead armor. The crews stood exposed behind their guns, visible to any airplane or shell burst overhead. A man fighting in an M3 required a particular kind of courage. The courage to stand in the open while German tanks fired at you. One of those men was Staff Sergeant Bill Harper, 23 years old, from Titus County, Texas. Harper had enlisted in December 1939 in Dallas, before Pearl Harbor, before America was even at war, and transferred to the 601st when the unit was redesignated. He had already survived Kasserine. Now he was dug in on a Tunisian ridge, waiting for the 10th Panzer Division. Behind the 601st, the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion provided additional firepower with newer M10 Wolverines, proper tracked vehicles with open-topped turrets, and 3-inch high-velocity guns capable of penetrating any German tank in North Africa, and the minefields. During the night, engineers had laid mines at locations chosen by studying exactly how German armor had attacked at Kasserine Pass. Every lesson from that defeat had been analyzed, incorporated, and turned into a defensive position designed to exploit German habits. At approximately 0500 on March 23rd, the trap was set. And then the motorcycle blundered into the lines. The captured German soldier confirmed what scouts could already see in the dim, pre-dawn light. A square formation of tanks and self-propelled guns moving across the valley floor. The 601st's Reconnaissance Company, under Captain Michael Paulick, was positioned farthest forward. Paulick's men opened fire on advancing Panzer Grenadier infantry at close range. The sudden fusillade stunned the Germans. Paulick estimated his men inflicted more than 50 casualties in the brief, violent firefight before pulling back behind the main defensive line. Now the tank destroyer companies braced themselves. B Company's 2nd Platoon engaged first. First Lieutenant Robert Luthi, the platoon leader, watched men coming over a ridge toward his position. He let them close to 1,000 yards. Then he ordered all guns to fire. The German column kept coming. Panzer IIIs and IVs led the advance, not Panthers, as some accounts incorrectly claim. Panthers would not appear until Kursk in July 1943. These were the medium tanks that had conquered half of Europe. Behind them came Marder tank destroyers and armored half-tracks carrying infantry. The column advanced at speed across flat ground roughly 2 miles wide, engines roaring, treads churning dust. They were confident. They had beaten Americans before. They expected the same result. At approximately 400 yards from American positions, the lead tanks hit the minefield. Explosions tore tracks off chassis. Tanks lurched to a stop. Crews bailed out. The column behind them bunched up as vehicles tried to avoid the mines. And then the artillery spoke. Not one battery, not 2 batteries. Every American battery within range. 105mm howitzers, 155mm howitzers, all firing on the same target, at the same time, using the coordination procedures developed in the 4 weeks since Kasserine. The new fire direction system worked. Forward observers tracked the German column from the moment it entered the valley. When the tanks hit the minefield and bunched together, the order went out. Fire for effect. The first salvos landed among the stalled German tanks. High explosive rounds detonated against armor, disabling tracks and turrets. The bombardment was continuous, salvo after salvo, with no pause for the Germans to reorganize. Half-tracks, their thin armor useless against artillery fragments, exploded. Infantry, who had dismounted to clear mines, were caught in the open with no cover. The German column was trapped, unable to advance through the minefield, unable to retreat through the artillery, being systematically destroyed. When the barrage lifted, the tank destroyers opened fire. The 601st engaged from concealed positions, targeting German tanks methodically. The crews had studied how panzers maneuvered. They knew where to aim. A half-track would pop up to the ridgeline, fire, then back down behind the ridge before the Germans could return fire. But the pace became so furious that many crews could no longer afford to back down. They stayed on the ridgeline and fired until the barrels were hot. The first group of 30 tanks turned left and started up the highway toward El Guettar. This group ran straight into A Company of the 601st, which poured fire into the German flank. Within minutes, 8 tanks were knocked out, and the rest fell back. The remaining panzers swung toward B and C companies on the ridge. Lines of tanks with infantry advanced as if on parade. The Americans hammered them with armor-piercing rounds. By 0900, 3 hours after the attack began, 30 German tanks lay destroyed or disabled across the valley floor. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew to the mountain pass. The cost to the 601st was heavy. 21 of its 31 M3 gun carriages were destroyed, nearly 2/3 of its combat strength, in a single morning. The 899th lost 7 of its M10s. The crews of those vehicles had fought and died, standing exposed in their open-topped half-tracks, while German tanks fired at them. This was not some sanitized Hollywood victory. These were men who died on their feet behind their guns because they refused to run. During the height of the battle, 2 German tanks broke through and approached Allen's command post. Staff officers suggested he withdraw. Allen's response became legendary among the men of the Big Red One. "I will like hell pull out, and I will shoot the first bastard who does." The Germans tried again. At 16:45 hours, the 10th Panzer attacked from a different direction. trying to flank the American positions. The result was the same. American artillery delivered massed fires. Tank destroyers engaged from prepared positions. German tanks were destroyed before they could close with American infantry. Later, the Germans even tried a ruse: soldiers in American uniforms driving a captured half-track. That did not work either. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division had withdrawn permanently. They joined Italian forces in the hills east of Guettar, but made no further attempts to break through the valley. Think about the timeline. February 22nd. The Americans are in full retreat. Their credibility shattered. March 23rd. 4 weeks later, the Americans are destroying an elite Panzer Division, and the commanding general is refusing to retreat with enemy tanks near his headquarters. From humiliation to defiance in 27 days. On March 26th, just 3 days after the battle, British forces launched Operation Supercharge 2, breaking through the Mareth line to the east. The strategic position in southern Tunisia collapsed. By April 7th, American forces from Guettar linked up with the British 8th Army. On May 13th, 1943, the last Axis troops surrendered. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity, more prisoners than the Soviets took at Stalingrad. But do not mistake Guettar for a clean, tidy triumph. The fighting that followed was brutal and costly. Over the next 2 weeks, American forces tried to push through the mountain passes east of Guettar. Italian troops defending hills 369 and 772 fought with extraordinary tenacity. Allen later wrote that most of his rifle companies were reduced to a single platoon, fewer than 50 men each, against a normal strength of 185 to 200. The victory at Guettar was real, but it was paid for in blood, and the men who earned it had no idea they were part of something larger than one battle in Tunisia. Because what happened in those 27 days did not just win a single engagement. It created a system of adaptation that would define American military power for the next 80 years. The reasons why are worth understanding, because they tell us something profound about why some organizations can reinvent themselves in weeks, while others take decades. Part 4. The system. Why America adapted faster. After Guettar, German commanders stopped calling American soldiers cowards. Intelligence reports acknowledged American tactical competence. Rommel, who had been recalled to Germany before the battle, later wrote that American forces had recovered very quickly after their initial shock and managed to contain German advances with surprising effectiveness. The respect was grudging, but it was real. Americans could fight. What made the transformation remarkable was not just the speed, it was the system that produced the speed. 5 factors, interconnected. Remove any single one, and the transformation fails. First, and this is the one that matters most, American forces accepted that they had a problem. That sounds obvious. It is anything but. Defeated armies almost never blame their own doctrine. They blame soldiers for lack of courage. They blame subordinate commanders. They blame logistics, weather, bad luck. They almost never ask the hard question, is the way we fight fundamentally wrong? Eisenhower asked exactly that. His after-action review of Kasserine was merciless. American tanks were sent into fights they could not win. The doctrine was wrong. American artillery could not mass fires. The coordination system was wrong. American units were scattered and isolated. The command structure was wrong. Not the soldiers. The system. This allowed them to fix systems rather than punish people. Officers who had failed at Kasserine were not scapegoated. They were reassigned to training roles where they taught the next generation exactly what not to do. Failure became institutional knowledge. Second, American commanders had the authority to make changes on the spot, without waiting for approval from bureaucrats thousands of miles away. Eisenhower did not need to cable Washington for permission to relieve Fredendall. He did not need War Department approval to rewrite artillery doctrine. He had theater-level authority to command as he saw fit. Compare this with every other Allied army. British commanders answered to the War Office in London, where committees reviewed major decisions. Soviet commanders answered to Stalin, who approved or disapproved tactical changes based on politics as much as military reality. German commanders increasingly answered to Hitler, who made tactical decisions from East Prussia based on ideology rather than battlefield conditions. American commanders in the field could change how they fought based on what they learned in real time. This decentralization of authority was an American tradition dating back to the Continental Army. In Tunisia, it proved decisive. Third, American industrial power provided the resources to implement changes at scale and at speed. New M10 tank destroyers arrived in North Africa within weeks of being requested. Additional artillery batteries were formed, trained, and assigned. Radio equipment that did not exist in January was mass-produced in February and issued in March. When something did not work, it was replaced. When something needed modification, the modification was implemented across the entire force. No other army had this luxury. British factories were targets for German bombing. Soviet industry had been devastated by the invasion. German factories were being strangled by Allied bombing. Only America had the industrial capacity to support rapid experimentation. An army that must fight with what it has cannot afford to try new approaches. An army with abundant resources can experiment, discard what fails, and scale up what works. Fourth, Americans were willing to learn from their enemies. No pride, no insistence on the American way. If the Germans did something better, the Americans studied it and adapted. Staff officers analyzed how Germans coordinated armor, infantry, and artillery. They developed specific counters to German methods. They adopted what worked and discarded what did not. Fifth, Patton's emphasis on training made the new approaches automatic. In his 17 days, soldiers practiced digging proper foxholes until they could do it in their sleep. Tank crews rehearsed coordination with infantry. Artillery batteries drilled the new fire procedures. Tank destroyer battalions trained as unified forces. By the time American forces went back into combat, the new doctrine was not something they had to think about, it was something they did instinctively. And here is the paradox that the British never understood. American inexperience, the very thing that had been a catastrophic liability at Kasserine Pass, became an advantage when it came to change. Why? Because inexperienced forces have less to unlearn. The British Army had decades of tradition, precedent, and procedure. Changing how they fought required overturning institutional investments that generals had built their careers on. American forces had no such baggage, nothing to defend, nothing to unlearn. They could change quickly because they had nothing holding them back. The British assumed the Americans would need 3 years to learn what the British had learned in 3 years. They were wrong. The Americans learned it in 27 days. Not because Americans were smarter, because American institutions were more adaptable. The culture of rapid adaptation that was forged in Tunisia did not end in Tunisia. It spread through the entire American army. The improved artillery procedures became standard in every theater. Combined arms doctrine was incorporated into training at Fort Benning. Tank destroyer employment was refined. Air-ground coordination protocols were tested and improved. By the time American forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, the improvements were already visible. By the Italian campaign in September 1943, they were dramatic. And by June 6, 1944, when American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the transformation was complete. The American army that landed in France was one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. When they encountered hedgerows in Normandy, they developed hedgerow cutters within days. When they faced superior German armor, they massed artillery and called in airstrikes. When defenses proved too strong, they adapted and found another way. Always. This tactical agility created what military theorists call tempo, the ability to force your enemy to constantly react to you, rather than implement their own plans. German forces that developed effective counters to American tactics found that Americans had already moved on to something new. The Germans were always one step behind, always reacting, never dictating. That imbalance of initiative was a direct product of the culture born in Tunisia. The culture of adaptation had become the defining characteristic of American military power, and it started in 27 days in Tunisia. Part 5 plus verdict, the legacy. On the evening of March 23, 1943, Terry Allen stood in his command post and watched the last German tanks withdraw from the Guettar Valley. His division had won. The 10th Panzer Division, one of Germany's finest, was retreating. The British who had questioned American competence would have to reassess. The Germans who had mocked American soldiers would have to recalculate. Allen did not celebrate. There was more fighting ahead. The campaign in Tunisia would continue for 6 more weeks. Allen's division would suffer 2,000 additional casualties in the final 17 days alone. 24 of his infantry companies were reduced to fewer than 100 men each, against a normal strength of nearly 200. After Tunisia, Allen wrote to his wife with words that revealed the weight he carried. "Our losses have been considerable and are saddening. Most of our infantry rifle companies are now down to 1 rifle platoon. It has been a terrific responsibility to have the division during this period, because very frankly we had to win, and the 1st Division had to set the pace. He had set the pace, and the pace had been brutal. Ironically, just months after Guettar, Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division during the Sicilian campaign, not for incompetence, but because his fierce independence and his soldiers' rowdy behavior clashed with Omar Bradley's vision of proper military order. The decision remains controversial. Eisenhower later said, "It is a terrible injustice to General Allen to hint that he was relieved for inefficiency." 2 days after being fired, Allen's face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The article praised him as a great division commander, but Allen's story did not end in Sicily. He came back. He was given command of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, a collection of green draftees. He trained them the way he had trained the Big Red One, with aggression, with compassion, and with an absolute refusal to accept anything less than excellence. He took the Timberwolves to Europe and led them all the way to the heart of Germany. Even Patton's biographers admitted Allen commanded them with brilliance and distinction. He retired with the reputation of having never lost a battle. He died in 1969 at the age of 81. And what about the 601st, the tank destroyer battalion that lost 21 of its 31 gun carriages at Guettar, but destroyed 37 German tanks, the only tank destroyer unit that ever fought in the way originally envisioned by its creators as a unified battalion against a concentrated armored force. The 601st received the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions that morning, the only time in the entire war that a tank destroyer battalion fought in the manner originally envisioned, as an organized independent unit opposing an armored force concentrated on a narrow front. It went on to fight at Salerno, Anzio, southern France, through the Vosges Mountains, the Colmar Pocket, the breaking of the Siegfried Line, and all the way to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat. 4 amphibious assault landings, 546 days of lethal combat, 10 campaigns, from the deserts of North Africa to the alpine heart of Nazi Germany. Staff Sergeant Bill Harper, the kid from Texas who had enlisted before Pearl Harbor, survived the war. So did Max Altschuld from Brooklyn, who would later write that only the soldiers who were there could attest to the accuracy of what really happened. Tom Morrison of a company left detailed sketches and accounts of Guettar that decades later would become primary source material for historians. First Lieutenant Thomas P. Welch wrote 150 letters home during the war, letters that would eventually become the basis for a book about the 601st titled An American Night. Many others did not come home. Their names are recorded in the battalion roster, names from every corner of America, men who stood exposed in open-topped half-tracks and fought German panzers because someone had to, and they were the ones who were there. Now, let us pull back and see the full picture. Consider the numbers one final time. February 22nd, 1943. 6,500 American casualties. 183 tanks lost, 50 miles of retreat. The worst American defeat of the entire war. March 23rd, 1943. 27 days later. 30 German tanks destroyed. The 10th Panzer Division driven from the field. The first decisive American defensive victory against German armor. Same soldiers, same army, different system, different leaders, different doctrine, different result. The men who fought at Guettar did not know They were part of a historic transformation. They knew they had been beaten at Kasserine. They knew they needed to prove themselves. They knew Patton was demanding and Eisenhower was watching. They knew the Germans considered them inferior. They knew the British doubted them. They fought to prove everyone wrong, and they did. The artillery reforms tested that morning became the most feared weapon in the European theatre. German prisoners from Normandy to the Rhine consistently identified American artillery as the most devastating element they faced. That system was born in the 4 weeks after Kasserine Pass. The culture of adaptation, the willingness to admit failure, learn from enemies, grant authority to field commanders, and change fast became embedded in American military DNA. After-action reviews became mandatory. Commanders who could not adapt were relieved. The lessons born from the ashes of Kasserine shaped American military doctrine for generations. Allen stood in his command post that evening, watching the smoke clear over the valley. The same valley where, that morning, 50 German tanks had attacked with the confidence of an army that had never been stopped. Those tanks were burning now. Their crews were dead or retreating, and the soldiers who had stopped them, the same American soldiers the world had written off 4 weeks earlier, were still standing. The transformation from Kasserine Pass to Guettar remains the fastest large-scale military adaptation in modern warfare. 27 days from humiliating defeat to decisive victory. Less than 4 weeks from tactical incompetence to operational effectiveness. It proved that armies can change, quickly, completely, permanently, when they have the honesty to admit failure, the authority to act, the resources to implement change, and the courage to trust their people. That was the real triumph of Guettar, not the tactical victory over the 10th Panzer Division, though that mattered. The real triumph was the institutional victory over failure itself, the proof that defeat does not have to be permanent, that an army, or any organization, can look at its worst moment and say, "We were wrong," and then fix it, in 27 days. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. Every single like tells the algorithm to show this to someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. We are rescuing forgotten stories from the archives every single day. Stories about real people who faced impossible odds and found a way through. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.